A continuación le cedemos la palabra al Dr. Francis O'Sullivan, quien hablará del futuro de la energía solar. Ingeniero eléctrico de la Universidad Nacional de Irlanda y PhD en Ingeniería Eléctrica de MIT. Sus áreas de interés en investigación se han enfocado en temas relacionados con tecnologías, políticas energéticas y economía. Su más reciente foco de investigación se ha centrado en los recursos no convencionales del petróleo y gas natural, el nexo entre el uso del agua y la energía solar. Cuenta con una amplia experiencia en los temas de producción y los fundamentos económicos de las cuencas productoras de los Estados Unidos. Welcome, bienvenido, recibámoslo con un fuerte aplauso.
So, good morning, everyone. I should also apologize for my lack of Spanish. This is my second time speaking here, so Alejandro and Andres will have to stop inviting me back until I learn some Spanish, I guess. Well, let me start by saying it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think this particular event and the work that Andeg are doing in bringing this together, for me, it's been very, very impressive. I think the span of topics that are being addressed today are extremely relevant to the challenges and the opportunities that are emerging in this region and perhaps more broadly internationally as well. And it's very, very good to have this kind of discussion and debate to try and chart the way forward. My remarks this morning are going to focus on really a prospective subject, so that of solar energy and its increasing importance as a vector for growing generation, growing low carbon generation and so on across many, many markets today. Still represents a very, very small role, of course, in the overall system today, but the scale of acceleration, of adoption in many markets is very significant now. And so it's appropriate for us to begin to think about the potential role that solar offers and the challenges that solar's integration will result in for many, many systems. Just to begin, I think it's important to provide some context with respect to the global solar sector today and where we're going over the next half decade, for example. In reality, solar is a relatively small proportion of total installed generation, perhaps around 250 gigawatts today. But we're going to see a very rapid acceleration of this over the next 4 or 5 years, and certainly into the future as cost trajectories continue to fall. And as markets continue to decide to adopt the technology because of concerns regarding carbon emissions, interest in expanding a more distributed system, and so on and so forth. This particular graphic here just illustrates one projection from the European Solar Photovoltaics Association, just looking at where we are today and where growth over the next 3 or 4 years is expected to come from. And you'll see that across the world, there's very, very strong adoption. So in North America, certainly, in China, in India, and here in South America and in Latin America, there's also an increased momentum regarding solar, the potential it can offer, and so on. I'm going to speak about that in a little bit more detail later. Just for some context, though, and perhaps to bring up the carbon issue first, and that's not to suggest that carbon is the only issue, because of course it's not. And I think we had a very interesting set of remarks today pointing to the potential that cleaner coal options will have. And frankly, I'd have to subscribe to those sentiments utterly. But it is the case that solar will play a much greater role going forward in the power system. And it is a powerful vector for further decarbonizing the system. As a pure renewable, or as the pure renewables go, solar is certainly the most interesting. It's by far the largest of those resources, and it's also extremely well distributed. So just looking at this map here of solar resource and its distribution globally, the key point really is that there's a lot of good solar resource across the world. And in particular, where strong demand growth is going to emerge over the coming decades. So China, India, here in Latin and South America as well. It's slightly ironic, of course, that the region with the highest solar penetration today is Northern Europe, Germany and so on. But that was a political decision, obviously, that they've taken. I think we're now transitioning into a place where there's going to be much more market-driven adoption of solar across this broad set of regions. And then finally, in terms of my context and setup slides, just a little bit about the technical paradigms that we're likely to be relying on. So there are really only two options for the short to medium term in terms of solar technologies. Photovoltaics, which are PV, which I'm sure everyone in the room is utterly familiar with. It's the ubiquitous solar panel on the roof. And it's really a unique technology in the energy space, in that its technical conversion efficiency is not sensitive to scale. There are no other technologies that offer you that technical characteristic. And this is really quite important because that has meant, and it is meaning, that we're seeing solar PV being deployed in a much broader range of settings than is possible with other energy technologies. It has opened up the rooftop option, for example. Now, there are really important economies of scale to consider, which I will discuss, but nevertheless, the fact that the technical efficiency of solar is scale invariant has led to this potential for a much more distributed solar system, or much more distributed power system broadly. We're seeing that in the United States. We're seeing that type of impact in Europe. And going forward, particularly in regions that are going to see strong need for new power system investment, the potential for taking a new approach to electrification, a much more distributed approach, is going to be enabled by solar PV and likely the coupling of solar PV to storage. Now, it's going to take a while for that to emerge, but that is certainly a pathway forward that's going to play a meaningful role in the power systems of the future. The other technical option is concentrated solar power, and in many respects, this is actually the ideal renewable technology. It is a dispatchable renewable technology, owing to the fact that there is a thermal stage in the conversion between the photon and the electron. So we can store that energy and it can be dispatched adequately at night and so on. Unfortunately for CSP, it does not scale very well, or at least it requires very large-scale plants to begin to enter into that kind of acceptable economic envelope. And that has meant that it has found it difficult to be deployed. In the United States, we have quite a few deployment projects for CSP, but really they've had to be heavily subsidized financially by the Department of Energy and others. And internationally, we don't see a real appetite for CSP. There may be a few markets where people are interested in pursuing it, but I think the scale of the capital required to develop a project, coupled with the fact that it is relatively uncompetitive versus PV, is going to mean that as a technology, it's not going to have a huge role going forward. So now let's talk about the rising sun. So solar energy finally becoming a player at the big energy table. And this is now happening in many markets. So over the past few years, we've seen, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this rapid acceleration in the deployment of photovoltaics. Last year, for example, 2015, there was about 50 gigawatts of PV installed globally. There's going to be closer to 60 this year. And that deployment is taking place across a range of markets. There has been a shift in the geographical center of gravity with respect to deployment. As you can see in the graphic, Europe really drove the initial growth, but now demand in Europe has really arrested owing to changes in the policies that are in place in Europe and so on. And going forward over the medium term, the commercially relevant time horizon, solar's big growth markets are going to be in regions like China, the United States certainly, Japan. India has a lot of potential. They're certainly talking big. And then regions at a slightly smaller scale like Chile are showing very, very strong growth, obviously. So this is kind of how that balance is shifting and how the deployment is varying geographically. And what we're basically beginning to see is the technology being introduced into very different market structures and so on. And we're seeing how that works, and we're going to begin to learn more about the challenges of integration on different system types. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that owing to this kind of technical scale insensitivity for solar, you can have a variety of deployment paradigms. So China, for example, focuses, and will continue to focus certainly, on very large-scale centralized facilities as the vector for growing its PV deployment. And in many respects, this makes a lot of sense. There are strong economies of scale associated with that. However, China is now beginning to struggle with issues regarding its transmission systems capacity to accommodate this rollout and so on. And I think it's a very interesting case study today with respect to the need to coordinate the broader power system planning exercise with the promotion of large-scale solar, for example. Japan is taking an utterly different approach. Japan is focusing, and I think this makes a lot of sense, of course, on deploying solar at the rooftop level. So they're really pushing towards a much more distributed system. And given the context that they're operating within, that makes a lot of sense. In the United States, as with all things, I suppose, we want it all. And so we are deploying across the range of scales. So we have a lot of deployment taking place at very large scale. About 60% of our capacity currently is represented in the very large scale utility systems. And then the balance is evenly split between what I would describe as kind of large commercial and industrial rooftop facilities on large warehouses and so on, and residential customers, so individual homes. And the individual home story in the United States, the residential solar story, is particularly important because it's leading to a lot of complexity for us and for our power system, particularly on the regulatory front and on the technical front at the distribution level. And so we're going through a lot of painful processes at a state-by-state level now with respect to the design of adequate regulatory frameworks and so on to support solar's adoption. And there are probably going to be a lot of lessons there for many, many other regions in terms of the potential advantages and disadvantages of the residential paradigm going forward. Now, just to provide a baseline with respect to residential solar in the United States, at least, there have been a number of very interesting developments that have allowed it to take off. Today, we have more than 1 million households with residential rooftop solar. Now, that doesn't represent a huge number in terms of the US broadly, but in California, 7% of residential structures have a rooftop solar system. In Hawaii, 25% have a rooftop solar system. And this is utterly changing the utility business along the entire value chain, from generation right the way through to distribution in those markets. In addition, the growth of residential solar has driven or has led to the emergence of a new suite of energy entrepreneurs, I suppose they could be termed. New companies that are using solar, and certainly into the future they're likely going to be offering storage as coupled services to the residential customer. And this is really challenging the economics for the traditional utility, the distribution utility, given today's regulatory structures. It's also challenging our market structures at the wholesale level because it's meaningfully altering power demand at different times in the day in different regions, and that's leading to a revision across many of our markets in terms of how we've structured them and how we're going to structure them going forward to ensure the levels of reliability, resource adequacy, and so on that we've grown used to continue to be available. Now, the real innovation at the residential level, and I'm just going to speak about this briefly because it's an important story, surrounds an innovation in offering the service to the customer. So, of course, traditionally, residential rooftop solar was a relatively expensive option, and in the United States, really the demographic that in California, for example, was really upper middle class, wealthy consumers who really wanted to own solar on their homes almost as a statement. Now, many of the subsidies and so on in place made it a good investment, but there was a significant barrier to adoption because the systems were expensive. A typical rooftop system in California will cost you $30,000, more a few years ago, obviously. And in addition, our subsidy structure was linked to tax credits. So you also had to have a significant tax appetite in order to be able to monetize the subsidy. The innovation that we saw on the business model that has been driven by companies whom you may have heard of, like Solar City, which is a Tesla-related company, lay in the fact that they realized that they could offer a lease-type product rather than selling the system. So they innovated at the financial layer, securitized the solar product, sold long-term power purchase agreements to residential customers effectively, and in doing so were able to eliminate some of the upfront barriers to adoption, the large capital expenditure, the need to monetize the tax credit, and so on. And this has meant that we have produced entirely new energy companies in the United States, in the power sector over the past 5 or 6 years, who have frankly really scared the traditional utilities. We've had a lot of revolutions in our energy system in the United States. Last year I spoke about the role of shale gas and how that's changed things. That has been a profound development in our energy system. But what is happening today in our electricity system is much more significant. Solar in particular, and I should stress, although it's not entirely economic, but it's a coupling of the political economy, is leading to a very different structure, a new regulatory structure, new participants, and so on. And that is really leading to a different structure for our power system. And that's why the residential story in particular has been important. And just to highlight that, here's a slide just illustrating how some of the leading developers have played a role. Today, basically 3 companies dominate the entire residential solar sector in the United States: Solar City, Vivint, and Sunrun. And these have been the companies that have been able to scale up, that have been able to lock in the customer value proposition effectively across several states. And these are the companies now that are really leading to a lot of concern for the traditional utilities and so on. Okay, so enough of how the market has evolved in the recent past and the business models. Let's speak a little bit about solar's competitiveness at the basic level. So, effectively driven by remarkable cost reduction gains at the module level, supported by China, I should add, we have seen dramatic reductions in the cost of solar energy across all of the international markets and in the United States over the past few years. This graphic here is just illustrating how US power purchase agreement prices have evolved over the past 6 or 7 years for solar at the utility scale. And I should stress that the US is a relatively expensive market, even at the utility scale. But today we are at a point where utilities, large utilities, are able to contract long-term solar for under $40 per megawatt hour. In fact, this morning, the lowest US PPA price ever was announced. Nevada Energy are procuring 120 megawatts of solar capacity at a rate of $33 per megawatt hour. And that's quite profound in the United States. That really means that solar is more competitive as an option than investment in new combined cycle gas, for example. And we can see this borne out in the aggressive procurement that's taking place. Last year, almost half of all the new generation capacity was solar. So almost half was solar, another 20 or 30% was wind, and the balance was combined cycle gas. So we're seeing this shift towards gas, or towards PV rather. It's still a small sector in terms of the overall impact on the power generation mix, but in terms of where the capital markets are focusing their efforts today, solar is where it's at. Solar is an exciting place to be. Internationally, I think the story is even more interesting. Again this morning, or maybe yesterday, a Chilean PPA was signed for $25 per megawatt hour, which is remarkable. In the US numbers, there is a subsidy baked into that. So in reality, the gross number is higher. In the Chilean context, there is much lower subsidy levels, obviously, and yet we're still seeing these extremely competitive PPA prices emerging. I think it's fair to say, and I'll put my hand up immediately, many of these projects, many of these numbers involve quite a lot of interesting engineering. There may be some write-downs involved in previous projects and so on to make this possible. But nevertheless, the secular trend is towards solar, at the utility scale at least, becoming an increasingly attractive option for new investment in generation capacity. This slide just illustrates that point in the US sector. Again, we're just providing an illustration of how we compare how solar today in the US compares with and without subsidy versus a combined cycle unit on your left. Basically, the story is pretty straightforward. In good solar markets like Southern California, where the resource is quite good, in fact, similar to the resource level here in parts of Colombia, an investment in a utility scale facility will be more competitive than the investment in a combined cycle facility in the United States. Now, this point is held up by many as very exciting, and it is very exciting. Okay, so the point is that solar has now arrived. I think Graham made a very interesting remark earlier that many, perhaps in the solar promoting side of things, effectively articulate stories like this, that the economics of solar have now reached parity, perhaps are better than conventional generation and so on, and this is true to an extent in some markets. The real question, though, and the real challenge is not whether or not solar is competitive today. The question is what happens as we move much more solar onto the system. And in that instance, there are going to be some profound changes in many, many markets. I'm sure Manuel from the IEA is going to speak about some of these dynamics later today. But let me just provide you with an important example from the United States with respect to how solar's success may actually become a hindrance to its success. So, this graphic encapsulates the important dynamic of how solar's competitiveness will evolve into the future as its penetration levels rise in some of our important markets in the US. So let me give you some specifics. So what I'm showing you here is how the wholesale market price in ERCOT, so Texas, which is a very important and very interesting system in the United States, will evolve as solar provides a proportionally greater portion of peak demand. So along the horizontal axis, you have the percent of peak demand being met by solar, and on the vertical axis, you have the wholesale clearing price in the market. Initially, effectively today, where solar only plays a small role in Texas, solar units and solar asset owners receive a price that's significantly higher than the average price on the wholesale market. And that's because Texas is a daytime peaking system. Solar is just producing in the middle of the day, so the hours at which the solar farm are generating happen to be the premium hours, and the solar asset receives a premium price for those hours. And in fact, that means that today, even if the LCOE didn't suggest solar was competitive, it may well still be competitive, dependent on the market characteristics that it's playing within. But as we begin to introduce meaningful amounts of solar to the system, so say 10% of peak demand now being met by solar, what you begin to see is that solar generation, which has a zero marginal cost, begins to flatten and then depress the price in the middle of the day. So this is not a new concept, but it's an important concept. Zero marginal cost renewables will suppress wholesale market prices. And for solar, and for the solar asset, what that means is that as penetration rises, very quickly the value of the power being generated by that solar asset falls. And you can see that in the blue line. So even though solar is reducing the average wholesale price a little bit, it's reducing the price it receives in a very considerable sense. And that really means that there's a great challenge, actually, for solar going forward. All of the cost gains that we've seen over the past few years, and they've been profound, they are still not good enough to ensure the longer-term, large-scale competitiveness of solar energy. So we're going to have to think about how we take much more cost out, actually, and that leads to lots of interesting thinking regarding both the panel and the balance of system and those technologies. The other issue that's very important is not related to the solar asset owner, but to the broader set of market participants. Because in this instance, along with suppressing the price received by the solar asset owner, you're suppressing the rent that all the other units on the market receive during those peak hours. So your base load systems, which were used to making some money during those peak hours, now see lower rents. Those lower rents mean it's more challenging for them to cover their capital costs. And going forward, it might be quite difficult to ensure adequate capacity investment on the system. So the balance with respect to solar's penetration and our ability to maintain adequate capacity, to effectively remunerate other participants who must be on the system, that's going to evolve. Different markets will have very different evolutions of that. Here, in South and Latin America, where there's a lot of hydro, that's quite a different circumstance than many of our systems in the United States, where hydro plays a much smaller role. But nevertheless, in any system where solar or wind to a lesser extent plays a bigger role, these kind of issues are going to have to be contended with, and they're going to be important factors in shaping a more renewables-heavy future. And I should stress, this is not some sort of theoretical outcome. This has happened. This is happening today. This has happened in Germany. So this graphic here it just illustrates exactly that point. The lines, and I apologize for the colors and the confusion, but the lines effectively illustrate the shape, the normalized shape of the wholesale market price over the course of a typical day in Germany from 2006 right the way through to 2012. And during that period of time, Germany, because of its feed-in tariff in particular, added a very substantial PV capacity. And that PV capacity did what PV does. It generated a lot of power in the middle of the day. And as you can see, the wholesale market price in the middle of the day was suppressed quite considerably over that period of time. This means that today, for example, in Germany, the wholesale market price in the middle of the day is often lower than the average wholesale market price. And that's a challenge for German utilities, and we've heard a lot about the struggle that German utilities have had in the past few years. This is part of that dynamic. The other issue that must be contended with as we move a lot more solar onto the system is the technical issues that will arise from having that level of intermittent renewable. So to just illustrate a point, what I have here again is the Texas system at 4 different levels of PV penetration. On the left, you have a situation where solar meets about 10 or 12% of peak demand on the system. And what you'll see there is that in that yellow region, you actually meaningfully reduce the capacity requirement for non-solar. So there is a degree of capacity credit associated with solar in this instance. But as we move much higher levels of solar onto the system, we don't gain any further capacity credit. And that's because of the coincidence or lack of coincidence between peak demand and the solar generation. I should stress, this is an example that's absent of a lot of storage on the system. Now, in addition, as we move to much higher levels of penetration, we're also going to face real challenges with respect to ramping of the other assets on the system. Again, as Graham mentioned, more conventional assets are not well designed often to ramp significantly. Startup and ramping costs are going to increase on the system. And actually, if you revert back to one of my earlier slides that showed how the wholesale market price changes as PV penetration increases, you'll notice that once you get to high levels of PV penetration, wholesale prices actually begin to rise again. And that's because although you're introducing a lot of zero marginal cost electricity from solar, you're also increasing the cost of running your other assets. So to overcome this, we're going to have to think about storage. Storage, of course, is going to have an added cost. So, the trajectory, the path towards a more solar-heavy system becomes quite complex indeed. The other point that I just want to briefly touch on now is to again emphasize that the wholesale market story and the residential market and how solar plays can be quite different. And that's certainly been the case with our experience in the US, as I briefly alluded to earlier. So effectively, we have two business models for solar in the United States. At the utility scale, we have a very competitive world, actually. We have effectively a monopsony arrangement where we have large utilities issuing RFPs for large amounts of PV capacity. And many developers aggressively compete for that business. And that's led to the consistent downward trajectory in our wholesale prices. By contrast, the residential business is not about the cost of solar, actually, at all. It's about offering value to the consumer. And actually, offering value to the consumer can often mean that the price of solar can be decoupled from the underlying cost of solar. Basically, what has happened is that our residential solar developers have learned that US consumers, at least, think that a discount of maybe 10 or 15% on the rates that they pay their incumbent utility is a good deal. And so solar lease products, solar PPAs, and so on are now being priced directly linked to the utility rate in different markets. It's effectively illustrated here in this graphic. Apologies. So it's quite a simple narrative, actually, though it's not one that's tremendously value accretive for the consumer. Basically, the model is that we go to higher cost markets like California and like the Northeast, where there is an appetite for solar at the residential level and where there are substantial subsidies as well. And then we offer a lease product that is solar-based, but is not really related to the underlying cost of the asset, that delivers some value to the consumer. And consumers are lapping it up. As I said, we have more than 1 million customers now. This, however, it's proved a very effective means of growing the residential solar business to a certain level. But what we're now seeing is that companies like SolarCity, and for those of you who follow the markets, you will know that they're beginning to have some challenges. Companies like SolarCity are going to have to think of a slightly different business model as they have to grow out of these expensive markets where they've penetrated rather effectively and into markets where the cost of electricity is lower. So Texas being an important example, Florida being an important example. And basically I think the message here is that the lease business for solar, at least at the residential level, has likely run its race, and that we're going to revert now to a model that's based more on pushing through the underlying costs and the cost gains that have been achieved recently to the consumer and providing them with loan products or other financing vehicles. Because these new innovators, the solar cities of this world, their balance sheets can no longer handle the large capital requirements associated with this type of deployment. It's an evolving space. I think for this group here at least, I think it's an interesting case study regarding how innovation has evolved, driven by solar in a few markets, and how it will have to evolve further going forward if it's going to remain successful. I'm going to share these slides so you can spend some time reflecting on this. This just illustrates that point that although wholesale or utility scale prices have fallen dramatically over the past 4 or 5 years, residential prices in the United States at least have not, and that's because of this difference in the business model. Going forward, this will certainly have to evolve. So, I'm going to shift gears somewhat now and speak a little bit about the technical pathways forward for solar and the realities of whether or not the market-driven challenges that I just spoke about, particularly in terms of market price suppression, whether or not they can be overcome with technical paradigms that we have today or potentially new technical paradigms. So first and foremost, today in the United States at least, roughly speaking, a PV system can be had for about $60 to $70 per megawatt hour. That's the equivalent energy price based on our current capital costs. As we begin to move a lot more solar onto the system, that capital price is just going to be too high. Price suppression will occur in the markets. Investors will not be willing to invest because the return will not be there. And so we're going to have to reduce capital costs quite significantly. We're certainly going to have to get to a region between $30 and $40 per megawatt hour unsubsidized by 2030, and perhaps a lot lower by 2050 if we're going to see this kind of large-scale deployment that many advocates are hoping for. And I think that's going to be a real challenge, actually, for the industry and for the technologists behind it. One of the reasons why that's going to be a real challenge is that today's PV technology actually is really, really quite good. People often speak about driving efficiency higher and higher, but in reality, we have approached asymptotically an efficiency region which is going to be very difficult or certainly very expensive to go beyond. And that's just illustrated here with respect to some of today's technologies. By the way, the SQ limit, the Schottky quasar limit, that is the thermodynamic, theoretical thermodynamic limit for a silicon cell. So today's systems, best systems are probably at 25% efficiency. Today's average deployed system is a good deal lower than that, but it's going to be quite difficult to move closer and closer to those very high levels. And in reality, because the price of modules has fallen so low, even if we did move that performance technically ahead, I don't think it would really move the needle. The balance of system is now what determines the cost of solar plant. The balance of system is really where the action is on. And that is why the United States has higher capital costs in Chile, for example, than India and then China. Very different local cost structures surrounding the balance of system are going to determine the economics of solar going forward. Now, today's crystalline technology, as I said, is it's doing pretty well. Technically, certainly, its efficiencies are reasonably attractive. It's very reliable, which means bankers like it, which means you can get money to build it, and so on and so forth. But going forward, it has some real disadvantages that are going to limit our ability to address this balance of system. First is that today's PV cells, although any of you who've seen it will not maybe believe me when I say this, they're still actually very thick, very heavy, and that leads to some challenges with respect to the balance of system. Modules are rigid, they require a lot of aluminum, it requires quite a lot of glass, and so on and so forth. And this all leads to relatively heavy and expensive balance of system. To really move the needle, we're likely going to have to move to an entirely different technical paradigm, a truly thin film technology. This isn't going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, certainly in terms of large-scale deployment, and perhaps that's more relevant for this audience. But certainly over the longer term, 10, 15, 20 years, there are a set of new technologies that have the potential to lead to much lower cost module and balance of system. And really, to put on my academic hat, what that will involve from a chemistry point of view is quite simple. We're going to move away from today's technologies, which are based on very simple molecules, silicon, basically, but which have very complex and expensive manufacturing paradigms, to much more complex molecules, which have very, very simple synthesis processes. So these are technologies that can be printed effectively on roll-to-roll technology, on very thin, flexible substrates. And when you move to that type of paradigm, you're able to dramatically reduce your balance of system costs. You can also have transparent solar cells. And this is a reality today, and it's likely going to be a deployed technology in the medium term. Every window will be able to be coated, and that window then will become an active source. That's not going to really drive bulk power requirements, but it's going to meaningfully alter the balance, again, between centralized and distributed generation and so on. So these are things to bear in mind. And these technologies exist today, actually. These are 2 examples from MIT. The first cell on the left is a pretty effective, about 8% efficient solar cell that can be printed on a piece of paper. In fact, it's just printed with a laserjet printer. And just as a quick anecdote, we had some visitors, I won't mention from where, but a large Asian country who came to visit us at MIT. And we passed around this piece of paper with the solar cell, and when it came back, it was missing piece of the paper. It was interesting, but I think it was an interesting illustration that people are very interested in understanding these new types of technologies. And as I said, it won't change the world today, but it's going to play a role into the future. So, I'm going to kind of wrap up my remarks in the next few minutes with a broader systemic view with respect to the role of solar, how that's changing, and in particular with respect to the role of the regulatory framework in determining a future. It will have a US-centric view, certainly, because we're very close to that. I'm very close to that process now. But I think there are salient lessons for every market, actually. So the first story is this whole issue, or the first theme is really this whole issue of the emergence of a more distributed power system. Now, of course, different regions, different markets are at different stages in terms of their appreciation and adaptation of this kind of concept. In the United States, at least certainly today, we have a tremendous amount of noise with respect to what distributed energy resources are going to do for our power system, how they're going to fundamentally alter the business of supplying energy services, how they're going to drive the rise of an energy prosumer, and in some circles, how they're going to really cause tremendous technical and commercial challenges for incumbent utilities. I think, dependent on your perspective, all of those kind of views of the future are very valid. The realities are the following. Distributed energy resource technologies, so generation, like PV, but some others, coupled with intelligence in terms of IT infrastructure, and storage. And today storage is not quite where it needs to be, but it's coming. do offer the potential to reshape and drive value, introduce value to the power system in certain regions. Now, it is not universal, and today a lot of the narrative is one of universalities, that we can profoundly turn the system upside down. I certainly don't agree with that point. But it is true that these DERs will be able to add value at certain points on the system, and that will be good for the entire system. So a few points with respect to why we might want to go to a distributed future. Well, first, the technologies can add some real location-specific advantages. In particular, they can manage things like network congestion and constraints, and that's a big issue in some of our older systems, so certainly more mature systems. They also add reliability, and that's an important issue that people are increasingly focused on. And they add this opportunity to build out entirely new systems without having to dive into the very large-scale, vertically integrated, transmission-centric paradigm that has been the case for a long, long time. And they also add a lot of systems, broad benefits. They provide you with energy and capacity and so on and so forth. What you need to do, though, is you really have to have the capacity within your broad power system and the regulatory paradigm that defines that to adequately assess where the value exists and where the value doesn't exist. So that involves being able to look at the system today, look at where investment is going to be required, and then think about whether or not the best value for the system, for the social welfare, for the consumer and all of the stakeholders will flow from a more centralized deployment or from a distributed deployment. And we are, at least in the United States, now entering into this debate on a state-by-state level because we have a very complex regulatory structure, and I think it's going to be difficult to come to a consensus because of the political economy that defines this. But nevertheless, this is an unavoidable truth. We need to better be able to assess where the value is and then provide the ability to go after that value for different stakeholders. Just as an example of that, New York State has one of the most advanced restructuring processes in terms of the distributed system. They're looking to really allow new entrants into the D side of the business, and they're looking to do that in a reasonably efficient process. For those of you interested, the process is known as the New York REV process, or Reimagining the Energy Future in New York. And it's an interesting case study in how difficult this is. But one thing that flows from that process is that if we look at New York and we look at where the value of, let's say, distributed solar exists, then you can see that in different parts of the state, the value varies dramatically. So in the box that I've highlighted, we have two regions. One is Long Island, which is a zone which is highly constrained from a transmission point of view. And the value of distributed resource there is very significant, and it really makes a lot of sense to go after that. The other region is the Mohawk Valley, which is upstream in upstate New York. There are no constraints. It's adequately supported today with the infrastructure in place. And in that instance, DER is a very expensive folly. And so New York is struggling with putting in place mechanisms that can effectively tease these issues out so that they can have an effective distribution of resource going forward. So, to wrap up, a little bit about the path forward. So first, I think the important point is don't look to the United States for a lot of your, for universal guidance. And the reason I say that is that we have a very, very fragmented regulatory structure, and, effectively every state has a different policy with respect to supporting things like solar, with respect to thinking about how their distribution utilities are compensated and remunerated, and so on and so forth. And this really has led to a lot of inefficiency. It has led to a lot of discussion and debate, which I don't think has been all that useful in the United States. I think we're striving through a number of important processes to develop some universal truths. New York REV is one of those processes, and that will be useful, I think, for other markets to kind of draw some processes or draw some learnings from. But you will also come and find a lot of bad examples in what we've been doing. One of those bad examples, and one of the most contentious issues that we now face, and I just wanted to bring it up here, because if I brought it up in the US, somebody would throw something at me, is that net metering at the residential level has become a real problem. So net metering, for you who are not familiar with it, basically means that if you have a distributed resource, like a solar panel on your roof, you will be compensated the full retail rate, both the energy and distribution charge, for the power you produce. And this was a very interesting and simple solution 10 years ago to the need to try and support solar at the time, which was very nascent, very expensive, and not really relevant. Today, though, as I said, in California, where 7% of homes have residential solar, this net metering arrangement has led to very significant transfers from solar asset owners to those who don't have solar on their homes. It has led to some people who have solar assets that are really very valuable being undercompensated for their systems. Some people whose solar assets are causing problems on the D side to be overcompensated for their systems, and so on. It's effectively a blunt instrument, and we have arrived at a point where you need a more thoughtful tariff-setting mechanism at the retail level in order to effectively support solar. And we're going through this process in different markets now in the US, trying to understand how to do this better, and it's going to continue to be an important political hot potato in our markets for the foreseeable future. I should add that simple feed-in tariffs, if they're not well thought about, don't solve this problem either. So, we're really entering a phase where really thoughtfulness with respect to tariff setting is very important. This is just highlighting that challenge further. So what that ultimately means is that we have to step back and more thoughtfully assess what we want to achieve with respect to delivering energy services, how we want to value the characteristics of those energy services, be it reliability, be it the carbon intensity, be it the locational specificity of that, and so on. And think about a much more complex set of tariffs initially, and then walk back from that to a politically acceptable set of tariffs. Not easy, but it will have to happen. So to conclude, some points. So first and foremost, solar is here, right? And solar is going to play a big, big role going forward. As I said, in markets like the US now, more than half of the capital being invested today in our energy system is being invested in solar. So now that's meaningful. The big boys are writing checks for solar, and that matters. So given that, we're going to have to see and we're going to have to prepare for how solar is going to alter markets. And we're not quite there yet, but we're beginning to understand what's going to happen. And we're going to have to think carefully about our market structures and so on to support this efficiently, and to also ensure that the broader set of system participants don't get badly burned. We may also have to think carefully about a longer-term approach to technology development, but that's more a long-term R&D issue. Nevertheless, in the shorter term, we're going to have to think about adequate preparation for the challenges of intermittency at scale. That's going to mean we're going to require a lot of storage and so on, and those technologies and how we incentivize and support them will also have to be wrapped into this discussion. And finally, we have to think even more carefully about subsidies, if we want subsidies, or rates, and how we structure our rates so that the potential value that solar really can deliver can be effectively and efficiently realized without leading to overbuild or underbuild, and broadly driving the maximum social welfare possible. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. I'm not sure how I did on time, probably very badly, but it's okay, great. Thank you very much.